we're recording. Hopefully only my face will show in the recording. If not, I have some video editing to do. So we are continuing our trek through the calendar with renewal and return is what I decided to call tonight, with Rosh Hashanah, the month of Elul, and Tu B'Av. So you can be forgiven for thinking Tu B'Av, what the heck is that? We talked about Tu B'Shvat, and we talked about Tisha B'Av, and so Tu B'Av is neither of those things. They name some holidays are just named after the day on which they occur and the month in which they occur, and Tu B'Av is one of those too. So there's no official name for it. So we studied all of these other things, the calendar structure and Passover and counting the Omer and Shavuot and the 17th of Tammuz and the 9th of Av. And so now we have gotten through all the big fasts of the summer and we're kind of moving on. So we'll talk about Tu B'Av, Elul, and Rosh Hashanah in this order, not the order that they are on the title slide. But, you got to lead. The marketing has to lead with something that people actually know about, usually. So Tu B'Av is the 15th day of the month of Av. And for a lot of us, what the heck is Tu B'Av is the operative question. Because this is not something that's actually celebrated very much. Some people do as like a renewed interest kind of thing, but this is not something that really drew a lot of note for the last, however many centuries, really. So what the heck is Tu B'Av is a pretty legitimate question at this point. And so we'll look at it. So Tu B'Av, the 15th of Av, is kind of letting out some stress. We're 6 days after Tisha B'Av. So when the month of Av begins, you start doing things to make yourself a little more miserable because you're getting to the day when you mourn the loss of the temple. And Tu B'Av lets out some of the stress afterward. So it's actually mentioned in the same tractate of the Talmud that Tisha B'Av is, and it says, Shimon ben Gamliel said, there were never such joyful days for Israel like the 15th of Av and Yom Kippur. And you can be forgiven for saying, Yom Kippur, joyful day? What are you talking about? On which the daughters of Jerusalem would go out in borrowed white garments so that no one would be embarrassed for want. All the garments would require immersion. And the daughters of Jerusalem would go out and dance in the vineyards. And what would they say? Young man, raise up your eyes and see what you choose for yourself. Don't set your eyes on beauty, set your eyes on the family. For grace is a lie and beauty is vanity. So this vanity is Havel, the same word that's in Ecclesiastes to mean vanity, not emptiness, vanity. A woman who fears Yahweh shall be praised. And this is supposedly what happened. It's difficult to piece apart what the rabbis are saying the women said and what the rabbis are saying to explain the holiday. And it seems as though this is what the young women actually said, set your eyes on the family, and then this is the rabbis explaining, citing a couple of verses from Proverbs. So we're justified in asking, okay, first of all, joyful days, 15th of Av, sure, I guess. Yom Kippur, how is that a joyful day? Where is the story about the daughters of Jerusalem going out in borrowed white garments and dancing in the vineyards? On Yom Kippur? Yom Kippur is a day when people go dancing in vineyards? Not usually. So what the heck is going on here? And these are days that are associated with the beginning and the end of the grape harvest. You don't know this until you read commentaries, but essentially the grape harvest starts, the rabbis say, on the 15th of Av, and it ends on Yom Kippur. So this is the beginning and the end of a season where you're pulling in all of the grapes to make wine. So, okay. Which means we've got more agricultural holidays, right? This is the Tu B'Av, 15th of Av, is really an agricultural tie, and this holiday, this idea of women going out and dancing on Yom Kippur makes Yom Kippur an agricultural holiday too, which it is not naturally. When you look at the Torah, it doesn't really talk about agriculture stuff with Yom Kippur. So this is interesting in just the sense that it now has turned Yom Kippur into an agricultural holiday when it kind of wasn't. It doesn't have an express association with agricultural stuff in the Torah, but it does with this. And then the rabbis over time sort of developed other interpretations for why people go out dancing on the 15th of Av, why this celebration, and they came up with, these are all ex post facto, right? Just after the fact explanations. Like there was a change in Jewish law on this date to permit marriages between tribes. So there was this idea that a woman from one of the Israelite tribes and a man from another Israelite tribe couldn't marry because it was possible that tribal land would move from one tribe to another, and you didn't want that to happen because you wanted each tribe to maintain its own land. But there was a change in Jewish law to allow that, and so this is what we're celebrating. Another theory, permission for the tribe of Benjamin to enter the broader Israelite polity. So there's a long story in the book of Judges that we won't get into, where the tribe of Benjamin turns against a number of the other Israelite tribes, and they are ostracized for a while, and then they're allowed back in, and this is the day they were allowed back in, according to the rabbis. There's no way of knowing if this is true, right? So if this event ever happened, which we really shouldn't assume the stuff in Judges happened, it happened in like 1100 BCE, and the rabbis are writing in 500 CE. So 1600 years apart. They don't know what happened. The date when the Israelites in the wilderness stopped dying of a particular plague. So that's a joyous event. They stopped dying of a plague. Great. So people will go out and dance in the vineyards. Or the date when those killed at Beitar during the Bar Kokhba revolt were buried. Again, they're not picking the most joyous of occasions to explain why people would go out into the vineyards and dance and have what is a semi-rabbinic kind of quasi-Sadie Hawkins thing. These aren't great explanations, I don't think. I think they just don't know. It's this thing that people did, and it was associated with the wine harvest, and they're rabbis. They got to come up with stuff. They can't just say, we don't know. And the story about the borrowed dresses. So the prior slide, come on, go back. The prior slide says that the daughters of Jerusalem would go out in borrowed white garments so that no one would be embarrassed for want. It's like, what does that mean? The Talmud says that the highest woman in the hierarchy would borrow from the next woman down in the hierarchy. And everybody borrowed from the next person down in the hierarchy, and the poorest people borrowed from the wealthiest. So that everybody had something to wear, and no one was easily identifiable with their economic class, right? Because, again, we saw this don't look at beauty, look at the family kind of thing in the rabbi's text. So maybe that's what this is connected to. Again, this is the rabbis talking about it. In the Talmud, did they really know? Did this really happen? Who knows? Nobody talks about this other than the rabbis. But you will occasionally find people talking about this holiday and trying to kind of give it some new life in the modern world. And so it's kind of interesting to know about, I guess. And it's the next stop on the calendar after Tisha B'Av, so it was worth looking at just to kind of say, hey, there's a really weird holiday here. You didn't know about it, but now you do. So that's what Tu B'Av is. And you're absolutely welcome to ask questions. I have to tell you, there's just not very much text on this holiday to start with, so there's going to be a lot of questions you ask, and I'm going to go, I don't know, because we don't know. But you're
What,
welcome
if
to ask.
anything, do Orthodox Jews do to commemorate this holiday?
Usually nothing. Some feminist-leaning Orthodox Jews do at least occasionally mention it, but mostly nobody does this or marks it in any significant way.
So when it talks about the change in halacha to allow marriage between tribes,
Mm-hmm.
they're talking about in post-biblical times, or no, it couldn't be, because what are they talking about? Let me just say why I'm asking. There's a story, and I'm sure you remember it better than I do, because you're the rabbi, and there's a story that the daughters of a man who died, you're not,
Mm-hmm.
were unhappy because the father's wealth didn't go to them, and they pleaded. I guess this is to Moses, so this is
Yep.
directed to Moses. Why can't, just because we're female, why can't we inherit? And so the order went out, yes, you can inherit. Oh, actually, that consulted directly with God, as I recall. And God said, yes, they can inherit. But God made an error. God wasn't thinking forward enough, because if the daughters can inherit and then the daughters marry into a different tribe, then the tribal land gets reallocated to the new tribe.
Yep.
And so then a second, or so there had to be a revision. That had to check with the Senate parliamentarian to see if they could make a revision. And the revision was made that if a woman inherited her father's property, she had to marry her relatives in the same tribe. And these three daughters, I know one of them was named Noah, N-O-A.
Yeah.
And I remember being, ended up marrying their cousins, because in order to keep the land within the tribe. Anyway, the implication of that is that marriage between tribes was always okay. I mean, that's the way I interpret that story.
Yeah. So whatever this halacha is that they're talking about, I don't know what it is. So the story is the daughters of Tzalafachad, that's the guy's name, is Tzalafachad. And Tzalafachad dies, he only has daughters. The daughters go and ask, hey, can we inherit? The answer comes back, yes. And then there's another answer given. So there's another piece to this story which is really easy to lose track of, which is that the daughters actually promised that they wouldn't marry outside the tribe.
Right.
So they said, oh, we won't marry outside the tribe. And despite that, the elders of the tribe come to Moses and say, you can't let them marry outside the tribe. And it's easy to lose track of the details because it's a single story, but it's split. So it's in two pieces in the book of Numbers, but they're separated by another narrative or two. So you have to kind of read it and put them together. And this is one of those stories that is sometimes cited for being feminist and forward thinking, because women can inherit when there's a proper situation. And it's actually discussed that way in the women's Torah commentary that the Reform movement published. And I kind of think that's a ridiculous thing, because it means that you ignore the second half of the story where actually the men don't trust them to do what they say they're going to do. Right? So the story seems to imply that, oh, well, you can marry between tribes, except in this one situation. I don't really know where this came from. It's the rabbis seem to think it existed, but they say it and they don't really give it a lot of detail, right? So keeping with the rest of the stuff for the 15th of Av, for Tu B'Av, which, in all seriousness, it's like the last page of this tractate of the Talmud. Starts on the second to last page, rolls to the last. And you get to the end of this stuff about Tu B'Av, and there's one other thing, and then it says, end of tractate Ta'anit. So we just don't know a lot of stuff. It's a little bit of a mystery, but yeah.
So if somebody were to ask me what is Tu B'Av, would the simple answer be it's associated with the beginning of the grape harvest? And then
it's like a festivity associated with the beginning of the grape harvest. I think that's really probably the most solid answer that you could give.
Right.
I would almost always end up footnoting it with, but we don't know that this actually happened, because it's the rabbis talking about it 500 years after the temple's destroyed, and who knows?
Right.
Right. You got to really you have to put a pin in a lot of this stuff and say, well, I don't know.
But that would make the grape harvest very long, right?
Yeah.
I mean, would it be
Yeah.
2 months long at that? So
A little bit shy of 2 months, yeah.
right, from the 15th, right? Well, Elul and then into the. Let me just. When you say there's no agricultural reference in the Torah, well, that's often true. It's like Passover is the barley harvest. The Torah doesn't say that, but scholars who look into it will tell you that. Now, my recollection is from reading, Gaster and Schaus and people who write about these things, is that they don't talk about the high holidays having any agricultural basis. And so this is surprising to me to hear that the rabbis themselves refer to an agricultural basis for Yom Kippur, when, again, I haven't read this stuff in years, but I have no recollection of the so-called scholarly literature referring to this.
Yeah. This is the rabbis. We're going to see a couple of things where the rabbis are really getting stuff from we don't know where and creating meaning for holidays. This is what they do with Rosh Hashanah too. So we should get ready. They're going to make stuff up about Rosh Hashanah that didn't exist.
I think that it's pretty incredible way back then that there was talk of women inheriting, because when the country that prides itself in being a democracy was found, the United States, women were not allowed to inherit and didn't gain that right quite some time. So somewhere in the midst here, there's a progressive doing some writing or interpreting, because then we have a little bit of a democratization of the matchmaking process as well. Don't judge by beauty, don't judge by class and wealth. Well, a little judge by, is it a good family?
Yeah.
I find that remarkable too. And my question is, what is amongst the Orthodox, when there's matchmaking today, what's the carryover? What are the criteria? Which of these are the criteria? The family, yes. Don't judge by beauty, probably yes. I don't know about the wealth class thing.
Yeah, this is all over the place with Orthodox matchmaking. It's really difficult to get a very good sense unless you're in that environment. So we don't fully know. There's a lot of things that go into it. Status, relative status, social status existing between the two parties is a big one. So you will find that Baal Teshuvah, so these are people who kind of go back to Orthodoxy, you will find that they have a hard time finding spouses, because even though in theory there's not supposed to be differentiation between converts and not, the reality is there's a different social status. And Baal Teshuvas are often forced to enter into arrangements with other Baal Teshuvas. That's the option. So there's status, there's age, there's education. Somebody who is from a really nothing kind of family, but is a really elite scholar, has a better chance of having a match with somebody who's wealthy and enables that kind of thing. Enables somebody to just be a scholar for a while. It is unusual for women in the ancient Near East to inherit property. So this is, the inheritance of property is significant, but may be more connected to issues regarding preserving the territorial integrity of tribes, because that's not something that mattered quite as much in broader ancient Near Eastern law, but it matters for the Torah because this property is all supposed to revert and stay where it was over time. So, you know, there's a record of women having an inheritance, except maybe not. We don't know how often the land reverted, and there's all kinds of, you know, these sabbatical years and jubilee years that the Torah talks about. There's not a lot of evidence that some of the big stuff that happened with them, the land reversions, not a lot of evidence that happened. So it's really hard to know whether this was significant or not for that stuff, that for women inheriting rather than the land going out of a family entirely. It's really not clear. Because to be fair, these aren't really history books. Would that they were, but they're really not. Okay, so that's what Tu B'Av is. See, even a little tiny holiday has a lot of things happening with it, if you kind of scratch the surface on it. And then the next big thing is not a holiday per se, but it's an entire month, the month of Elul. So Elul itself in the Mishnah is called a new year. It's the new year for livestock. So remember that there's a tithing system to support the temple, and you need to figure out how old things are so that you know which things can or can't be tithed. And rather than track the birth dates of every single animal, you just kind of say, oh, it's livestock, it was born before date X, it's a year old, we can pick from that. And that's called Rosh Hashanah La Behemot, the new year for livestock, or domesticated animals. It also begins this period of intense introspection in many Jewish communities, because this is the run-up to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And it should be said, again, none of this is in the Tanakh. None of this is in the Torah or any other source other than the rabbis. We don't know about this holiday. We don't know about these practices but for the rabbis. So maybe they made it up. We don't know. But that's what's happening in the month of Elul. And so we should talk about Rosh Hashanah La Behemot because this is a holiday that definitely has gotten new steam. And new steam beginning in 2009, which is just an arbitrary year. When the rabbis would describe how tithing works, right? So you count every 10th animal, you put red paint on it, and that's the one that you donate. And when we looked at these texts about the new year, there was a dispute between the rabbis about whether Rosh Hashanah La Behemot was on the first of Elul or just was Rosh Hashanah like everything else. And so there was some uncertainty, and so they said, oh, those would be tithed separately. Again, nothing in the Torah about this at all. And the rabbis aren't really sure when this holiday happens, right? There are some rabbis who say, well, it should be on the first of another month, and so they sort of had a separate set of animals that they marked as, okay, well, we gotta tithe these separately because we're not really sure how to count them. Which suggests, again, maybe this didn't happen. Right? The rabbis are willing to do a lot of theoretical stuff in the Talmud, things that they never ran to begin with. They seem very intent on interpreting. And this may just be an example of that, right? We don't really know. It's not like there are ancient sources, Josephus or somebody like that, talking about when this happened. We don't have that information, so we don't know. This is just the rabbis talking, maybe. We've seen that the rabbis have a different calendar from every other Jewish group of their time, so this really maybe isn't so surprising that they've got a holiday that they've got here that they think makes things easier to administer, but never existed really because they never ran the temple. That's a possibility. In 2009, Jewish animal welfare advocates started to encourage Jews to observe the first of Elul as Rosh Hashanah La Behemot as a holiday on its own virtues and connect it with animal welfare causes. And some congregations do blessings of pets on this day. So they'll get together in a park and the rabbi will recite a blessing over the pets or whatever it is. Animal welfare issues have become more prominent in society generally and in Jewish life too. So it's not too surprising to see that this exists. There are Jewish vegan organizations and all kinds of other things. So it's not too surprising to see that there's a holiday like this. So it's worth knowing that it exists. It's slowly gaining steam. So every year, a few more congregations do something as a congregant learns about it and tells the rabbi, and the rabbi goes, okay, we'll do that. It exists. It's worth knowing about. People might do it at some point. Who knows? Joyce.
Yeah, I say we should do that. Wouldn't that be a great thing to do when we all get back together, like gather in a park and everybody bring their pets and have you say some kind of, nice thing as opposed to.
So you should know that you are the second person to suggest that.
I just think it's, because I've seen this, right? The Christians do this, right? There's like St. Francis something or other, and people bring their pets to church.
And you'll even find the Jewish Outreach Institute, which became Big Tent Judaism, that Paul Golan used to work for, had a program called Bark Mitzvah. Bark Mitzvah.
Yeah.
They, recognize family dogs, and they would get their Bark Mitzvah along with somebody in the family having their bar or bat mitzvah. Right? That was a thing that happened.
Right. I mean, I was saying it tongue in cheek, but it does sound kind of.
It's a real thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I wouldn't say it tongue in cheek. I would say it's a real. Pets are really important. We don't have one now. We used to have a dog. Pets are really important to people. You know that. So.
Yeah, I mean, in all seriousness, somebody has said, "I think we should do this." Like, in complete seriousness.
I'm saying it in complete seriousness.
Yeah. So, I think we could, if we did this, we would probably end up being the first humanistic Jewish congregation to do this. So it would be interesting. So, and it's a thing you do outside. Although it's a thing you do outside in August. So, some people might think, ooh, but
under a shelter or something,
Yeah, yeah.
right? But you know, and
Some shade.
you wouldn't necessarily bless. I mean, the idea of the blessing, you know, we could do our own interpretation, I guess.
Yeah, no, you're not going to put my hand on the animal and
Right,
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 but you know, something recognizing pets in people's lives is
right,
worth worth thinking about.
right. And I don't even have a pet right now, so but I still think it's a cool idea.
I don't need a pet. I have a teenager. I have all the cleaning up I need to do.
Yeah, right.
Well-
So, you know, the beginning of Elul is this maybe was Rosh Hashanah La Behemot, but certainly is now. But we also have information that from the first day of Elul until Yom Kippur are days of favor. Even though the Holy One, blessed be He, accepts repentance of those who return to Him wholeheartedly throughout the year. Nevertheless, these days are especially preferable and propitious for repentance, making them days of mercy and days of favor. For on Rosh Chodesh Elul, Moses ascended Mount Sinai to receive the second set of tablets, remained there 40 days, and descended on the 10th day of Tishrei, since repentance was then completed. So they are saying the first of Elul is important because Moses went up Mount Sinai to get the second set of tablets, and when he came down, it was the 10th day of Tishrei, which is Yom Kippur. So where did they get that from? Some hinky math, essentially. We'll see that it's a midrash that gets them there. It's worth knowing about as we go through this work, the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. So if you ever wonder how people who are Orthodox keep track of all the rules that govern their daily lives, for many of them the answer is the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch tells them what to do. It is not a legal code that a rabbi would use to reach a ruling. So some of the stuff that we have looked at and that we will look at today, Maimonides' Mishnah Torah and the Shulchan Aruch, the big Shulchan Aruch, and some other things, they're legal codes, but they're codes that have some explanation, and they are things that rabbis will look at in making a decision. That's not what this book is. This book is sort of an encapsulation of the rules that apply to most people most of the time throughout the year for holidays, life cycle events, what you do in the morning. Some basic business ethics are in there, how you deal with mourning practices. It goes into some detail on Shabbat laws and it assumes you know the basics. It is a one volume, untranslated, it is one volume. And it is based on Hungarian minhag, so we talked last week about how minhag isn't exactly law, but it isn't exactly just custom, that it's kind of got the force of law in a particular community. Hungarian minhag is known for being pretty strict. So the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch is pretty strict. Historical coincidence, essentially, has preserved these Hungarian legal texts as the ones that are used as kind of reference points now for Orthodox Jews post-World War II. And it's because Hungary was one of the last countries to empty itself of Jews, and it had Raoul Wallenberg saving Jews, and so there were a lot of rabbis, Hungarian rabbis, who survived, and they brought their rulings and their books with them. And they were the ones who survived, so they kind of have an extra amount of force in the Orthodox world right now. So Kitzur Shulchan Aruch is something that people use. You can find lots of translations of it. There's a translation of it online. I have it on my phone. I have 2 different translations on my bookcase. Like, this is as close as you get to an everyday, how do I do this kind of book for Orthodox Jews. So it's useful that you know it exists, because this is how people do it, right? They don't have every rule in their head. They have a book and they go, oh, Rosh Hashanah is coming in a month. Let me read those rules. Kathy.
Hi, yeah, I was wondering if the Sephardim use it also.
Not generally, because it does represent Eastern European practice primarily. But you will find some Haredi Sephardim, so really, really ultra-Orthodox Sephardim, which is a little quirky for the Sephardic world, might use it from time to time. And then Chabad has its own version of it, right? So Lubavitchers have their own version, and so you do have to know which one you're looking for when you're looking for the one that you need. But it does represent Eastern European practice rather than Sephardic practice. So some of the stuff that happens in Elul, Kitzur Shulchan Aruch says you do it X way, but that's not how Sephardim do it. So it's not that good of a reference for them. But since most American Jews are descended from Ashkenazic Jews, this kind of gets looked at by Reform and conservative rabbis too, as a convenient summary of the rules. And because of its Hungarianness, it just pulls everybody to the right, essentially. Just pretty weird. But yeah, this is like, how do I do this? This is the book. So in many congregations, daily prayer during Elul includes shofar blowing for some or all the days of the month. Sephardic communities tend to start on the first of Elul. We're going to blow shofar every day. Ashkenazic communities tend to wait until the last week or two. There's no real explanation for it exactly. It's just do. We know they do because the Shulchan Aruch says you do X, and then the glosses that are put in for Ashkenazic Jews say no, we don't. Why blow the shofar outside of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur? Again, the Torah doesn't say at the beginning of the 6 months start blowing the shofar, so this is something people came up with. And so we have this midrash. This is a collection of midrash called Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, the chapters of Rabbi Eliezer, even though he didn't write any of it. Rabbi Joshua ben Korcha says, for 40 days Moses was on the mountain reading the written law by day and learning the oral law by night. And after 40 days he took the 2 tablets and descended to the camp. And on the 17th of Tammuz, last week we talked about how the 17th of Tammuz was one of the days that was marked as a tragedy because the tablets were broken on that day. So, learning is cumulative, right? On the 17th of Tammuz he broke the tablets and slew the sinners in Israel. And he spent 40 days in the camp until he had burnt the golden calf and ground it up like the dust of the earth and slew all who worshipped the calf. And the Hebrew here is not worship. The Hebrews literally kissed the calf, which I thought was interesting to know. And destroyed idol worship from Israel and established each tribe in its place in the camp. And then on Rosh Chodesh Elul, come up to me toward the mountain. They sound the shofar throughout the camp. Therefore the sages decreed, you blow the shofar starting on Rosh Chodesh Elul each year. Again, we don't really know how they know any of the timing, because they kind of don't, right? They try to do some backwards math, knowing when Passover is and trying to guess from the Torah when certain events might have happened, and they come to the conclusion that Moses went back up on Rosh Chodesh Elul, and so we start blowing the shofar on the first day of Elul. That's it. That's their rationalization for the practice. In many congregations, there are special prayers called slichot that are recited. It's a separate chunk of the service. It's traditionally recited when it's dark outside, so people either recite them in the evening or they get up early in the morning before it's light so that they can recite them while it's still dark. For Sephardim, again, begins at the beginning of the month of Elul. Ashkenazim wait until the Saturday before Rosh Hashanah, unless Rosh Hashanah is really, really early in the week, and then they start the week before. And there are slichot prayers that are associated with a number of different holidays. So some of the fast days have them. There's one for Hanukkah and Purim. They have their own version. But the general one that's recited before the high holidays, and actually all the way through until Yom Kippur, starts with 13 attributes of forgiveness that are found in Exodus 34:6, which you may have actually heard recited. If you've been to a more traditional Torah service, this is actually recited as part of the procession of the Torah out of the Ark. And if you're counting, you probably are going to go, okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and you're going to go, wait, there's only 10 attributes. There's only 10. The 3 names of God are each their own attribute. That's how the counting works. I didn't make it up. I don't think it makes a ton of sense. But this is how Slichot services begin, and then there's a confessional where, you're knocking on your chest, and then several pages of religious poems requesting pardon on related themes to the 13 attributes. Most non-Orthodox Jews don't do this. It should be said. However, conservative Reform and Reconstructionist synagogues do preserve Slichot as a thing that they'll do on Saturday night before Rosh Hashanah begins. So we get requests, we get questions every so often before the high holidays. Hi, are you guys doing a Slichot service? No. This is not a humanistic Jewish kind of thing, this kind of service, but the Reform movement actually has a separate book for its high holiday set of books for the Slichot service that they do once a year. It's just a thing that people do, and it's stuck around because Reform and Reconstructionist and conservative synagogues are mostly descending from Ashkenazic Judaism, so they keep this big Saturday thing, even if they're not doing Slichot all the rest of the time. But again, not a humanistic Jewish kind of practice. So if you get an email from me saying we're doing Slichot, I've hit my head. I'll put it that way. It's not a thing we're going to be doing.
Very funny.
Like something happened to me. Not a thing we'll be doing. So this is all kind of like prep for the high holidays. And it's stuff that gets lost from a lot of modern Jewish practice because, we live in a very quick world, and when people are taught about the high holidays, we kind of teach people that you get forgiven for stuff on Yom Kippur, and Rosh Hashanah is when you start asking, and is also the new year. And that's not how it works in a traditional setting, because a very traditional setting takes seriously the fact that you've got to say sorry to all of these people, or you're maybe not going to survive to the next year. So this is a pretty intense period for people who follow more traditional streams of Jewish practice. And in more liberal Jewish settings, Slichot as a thing isn't becoming super important, but recognizing this period of Elul is. And so you'll get things like, there's a book called This is Real and You Are Completely Unprepared, which is about navigating the high holiday season. And it was written by a conservative rabbi, but a conservative rabbi who's known for meditation practice. And so the book is actually pretty okay, mostly from a humanistic and secular kind of perspective. But it's like Jewish self-improvement book, essentially, tied to the run-up to Rosh Hashanah, because it takes a while to figure out what you're doing if you've got to apologize and chase down everybody. So questions about that Elul stuff? Go ahead.
So you said there are some Reform synagogues. I was hearkening back to my childhood in a Reform synagogue that would they just do one day of this service, like a month before?
Yeah, they'll do it. They'll do it usually the Saturday before Rosh Hashanah.
Okay.
Sometimes they'll team up on it. Up here in Howard County, the entire non-Orthodox Jewish world got together and did a community slichot. I was not involved with that.
Right.
Like, I'm like, you guys do whatever you want to do. It's fine.
Well, this is like, but these words, you know, you're right. They remind me of when we went to the Yom Kippur service and they went over all these attributes of God, and so they're just saying the same thing again.
So the poetry, so it starts with this paragraph, this, you know, Adonai. So the Hebrew is Adonai Adonai Rachum V'Chanun Erech Apayim B'Rav Chesed V'Emet. Right. Okay. So you've probably heard it sung before, and I'm not going to sing it because I won't do it justice. It's cantorial, and I can't do that particular kind of singing well. And then there's more poetry built on those themes. So it doesn't just repeat this stuff. There is a huge amount of religious poetry in most fairly traditional prayer books that nobody reads. Or it shouldn't say nobody reads, but that most conservative, Reform, Reconstructionist Jews don't engage with. You know, it's the parts of the service where there's old men mumbling and everybody else is like, what page are we on?
Yeah,
That's this stuff.
I remember that part.
Yeah. That's these piyutim. Like, nobody knows what's going on unless you know what's going on. Right. So yeah, that's kind of what these are. But yeah, I didn't have anything to do with the Slichot service. We also did a series of videos for Elul, and I did one of the videos, and it was, you wouldn't have known that you wouldn't be able to tell what kind of rabbi I was, because I talked about Maimonides, and I didn't talk about God, and that's totally normal in a liberal Jewish context, so who knows? Who knows what people thought? So Michael Wicken says Alan Liu in San Francisco about the book This Is Real and You Are Completely Unprepared. Yeah, it's Alan Liu, who I've actually quoted that book during high holiday services. And it's one of those things, you know, high holidays are coming because every Jewish professional in the world says, oh, I'm rereading the book again. So in about 2 months, everybody I know is going to start reading this Fakakta book again. Okay, so Rosh Hashanah. Biblical Rosh Hashanah, Day of Blowing Horns. It's not called Rosh Hashanah. We've kind of talked about this with the calendar kind of thing before, that in the 7th month, on the first day of the month, you observe a sacred occasion. Don't work at your occupations. Observe it as a day when the horn is sounded, and make some animal sacrifices. That's it. That's Rosh Hashanah in the Torah. That's it. It's not called Rosh Hashanah. It's called the Day of Blowing the Shofar. That's it. Blow the shofar, kill an extra animal or two. That's all I need you to do. And we have almost no other mention of this holiday in the Torah. But then it says, when the 7th month arrived, this is the book of Nehemiah, the Israelites being settled in their towns, the entire people assembled as one man in the square before the water gate and asked Ezra to bring the Torah scroll. And on the first day of the 7th month, i.e. Rosh Hashanah, Ezra brought the teaching before the congregation, men, women, and all who could listen. He read from it facing the square before the water gate from first light until midday. So at some point, somebody decided that you needed to read a little extra Torah on the first day of Tishrei, which we call Rosh Hashanah. Nobody calls this holiday Rosh Hashanah. Nobody. Until the rabbis. Nobody calls this holiday Rosh Hashanah. Everybody calls it a day of blasting or a day of trumpets or a day of horns or something like that. So if there's no Rosh Hashanah, what's the deal with Rosh Hashanah? Like, why do we have this holiday? So if you look at the Jewish calendar, you have a bunch of holidays in the first month, right? So you've got Passover in the first month, but you've also got the start of the year, right? The Mishnah says that there's a new year in the spring, and that's the month of Passover. And it occurs in the first month, according to the Torah. And then there's a bunch of stuff in the seventh month, because the agricultural cycle is 6 months long. So spring harvest starts around Passover, fall harvest starts around Rosh Hashanah. So you've got some extra holidays in these 2 months. And Nisan and Tishrei both have a major pilgrimage holiday on the 15th of the month. So on one of them it's Passover, on the other it's Sukkot. Nisan is the first month of the year in the biblical calendar, so it kind of doesn't need a holiday. So the first day of the seventh month is what becomes Rosh Hashanah, and it gets a holiday for blowing the trumpet. Each of these months also has something happening on the 10th day of the month. So on the 10th day of Nisan, this is when you pick out the animal you're going to have for the Passover offering. And in Tishrei, Yom Kippur happens. So there's this predisposition there to maybe balance out the months. And when the Israelites go into exile, into Babylon, Babylonian religion's creation myths tie up to these 2 months. And they actually celebrate 2 new years, one in Nisan, one in Tishrei. They're both called the Akitu Festival. The Bible has a holiday ready to go for the first day of Tishrei. Ta-da, Rosh Hashanah. Except still no one calls it Rosh Hashanah, right? So it's like these ideas are out there in the ether, and Rosh Hashanah gets associated with some creation myths in Babylon, and that idea comes over, but nobody really writes about it. So nobody calls Rosh Hashanah until we get to the rabbis. Literally nobody is talking about it this way, except for a single text. So most of the texts that appear from the Bible forward all the way until the rabbis talk about blowing a horn, don't talk about the themes of creation, don't talk about themes of judgment. They just talk about blowing trumpets and offering sacrifices, except this one text. Pseudo-Philo / the Biblical Antiquities mentions the idea of reviewing creation. And it is generally thought to be dated after the destruction of the Second Temple. So at some point, Rosh Hashanah became associated with the anniversary of creation. It kept that meaning around probably, and it was ready to step in and give meaning to a holiday that otherwise you blow a shofar, but you can't offer sacrifices, so what's the point of this? This is the only source that talks about this holiday as though it's the Rosh Hashanah that we know. It does not call it Rosh Hashanah. It just talks about the themes. So it calls it the Festival of Trumpets. Nobody until 200 CE calls Rosh Hashanah Rosh Hashanah. Doesn't have that name. So the rabbis maybe gave it the name that it has. So again, the rabbis are creating meaning out of almost whole cloth. That there are some ideas floating around out there, and it takes a historical crisis and needing to figure out what you're going to do to deal with that crisis to then solidify the holiday this way. But we don't actually know that this is what happened because there's no way to track it. Nobody talks about it. There's not even an evolution of Rosh Hashanah in this direction. It's just all of a sudden there's a text, and then all of a sudden the rabbis call it Rosh Hashanah, and that's it. And think it's important enough to write an entire tractate of the Talmud called Rosh Hashanah. But we don't know where they got that name from. It just, boop, there it is, 200 CE, Rosh Hashanah. There it is. So the bottom line is Rosh Hashanah, as we know it, expands vastly past the biblical roots and is really a construction of the rabbis of the Talmud. How the shofar is blown, how many times the shofar is blown, what is said, this is all invented, essentially. So what are New Year's about for the rabbis? So we talked about how there are 4 New Years. But then the rabbis also think that some New Years are about judging the world and others maybe aren't. Right? So 4 times during the year, the world is judged. On Passover concerning produce. On Shavuot concerning tree fruit. On Rosh Hashanah, the entire world passes in front of him like a unit of soldiers. As it is written, who fashions all in their hearts, or maybe who fashions their heart mind, all is one. It's the Psalms, the Hebrew's fuzzy. And who discerns all their deeds. And on Sukkot, the world's judged concerning water or rain. So this is the rabbis taking Rosh Hashanah, a holiday that's kind of okay, on this one day you're going to blow the shofar and you're going to do some sacrifices, and in 10 days there's going to be a real holiday. This is the rabbis taking Rosh Hashanah and elevating it so that it's on the same level of importance, actually maybe more important, than Passover, than Shavuot, than Sukkot. Because this is when they say the entire world is judged. Is right here. So they seem to have done this all on their own. Created this kind of, I have to approve an iPhone purchase apparently. Hang in there. I have to enter my password. Okay, hopefully that satisfies whatever needed to be done. Sorry. I get a text message. Approve his app purchase. So I did. So this is Rosh Hashanah sort of getting its meaning and the rabbis promoting this holiday, right? Just like we saw the rabbis kind of promoting other holidays, right? Kind of making Elul something that it wasn't and making Tu B'Av something that it wasn't. Here we are. They've just promoted Rosh Hashanah all on their own. Kathy.
Yeah, I get this feeling that the rabbis, they had this religion that they were responsible for, right? And they're organizing their community. And it's an agricultural religion with a lot of animal sacrifice. And then as time moved on and the community got away from that, they had to just add all this stuff and create stuff, kind of turning it into pretzels to fit this old thing.
Yeah, that's exactly what they did. And there are rabbinic texts, I didn't cite any, but there are rabbinic texts that talk about, well, we can't sacrifice, so what do? We're going to pray instead. So no more sacrifices, but prayer of the heart works instead, so that's what we're going to do. And this is part of that process, right? We're not going to stop being Jewish, so what do? We can't have a temple. We don't have a temple. Every time we try to get a temple back, we lose. The Romans are too big for us to beat. So we're going to rework this thing. So that's what they're doing. That's exactly what they're doing. Is they are, okay, we're not going to quit doing this. So what do we do instead? And this is how Rosh Hashanah gets promoted, because we're not going to do pilgrimage festivals anymore. Can't go to the temple. We're still going to have these holidays, but we're not going to do sacrifices anymore. They lose a lot of their meaning. We're all scattered all over the world. But God can judge the whole world, right? So Rosh Hashanah goes from not even existing as Rosh Hashanah to one of the two major holidays, one of the biggest holidays, really over the course of about 130 years. That's all it takes, which is kind of light speed in the ancient world. But so that you can see how they're developing things on their own. So I've talked about Karaites before, that depending on your perspective, Karaites are heretics from Rabbinic Judaism, or are trying to preserve what Judaism really should be if you don't have all the rabbi stuff and you're really just interpreting the Torah directly. The rabbis call the seventh month the New Year. The Karaites go, it's the seventh month. Why do you rabbinites, and this is what modern Karaites call mainstream Rabbinic Judaism, they call it Rabbinite Judaism. Rabbin, Rabbanite. They say it's the seventh month. What's this nonsense about Rosh Hashanah? That's not in the Torah. Cut that out. The rabbis blow the shofar, right? This is a thing we know about Rosh Hashanah. You blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, right? The Karaites go, there's no temple, there's no shofar. You can pray, but there's no temple, there's no shofar. We don't do that. The rabbis tacitly accept this Babylonian stuff about creation myths getting connected to this day on the seventh month of the year and creating a bigger holiday out of a thing that's kind of a small holiday, but it's near some agricultural stuff. The Karaites, again, are, no, this is not, where did you get this from? Oh, you got this from Babylonian society. No, we don't do that. So they're probably, in this case, whether they're reverting or preserving, they view it as preserving, whatever it is they're doing, they look more like what maybe a lot of people did in the absence of a temple. Before the rabbis were really the people who were kind of running the show, is they maybe just said, okay, well, we'll do some extra praying stuff, but we're not going to blow the shofar. There's no temple. And this is not Rosh Hashanah. Nobody talked about it. It's like that came later. So it's useful to look at the comparison of what happened. Jack.
So this Karaite notion that because there's no temple, you don't blow the shofar, is that Tanakh faithful, which is to say, is the shofar in the Tanakh always or nearly always associated with temple practice?
This is a really good question, and it's actually more complicated than the Karaites make it sound. Actually, it's more complicated, and the Karaites are faithful to the more complicated approach. So if we rewind to... So if we rewind to these biblical verses, these are the two verses that tell us what happens on Rosh Hashanah. In the seventh month, on the first day of the month, you'll observe a sacred occasion. You shall not work at your occupations. You shall observe it as a day when the horn is sounded. Okay. The when the horn is sounded part, that's me translating. It is called Yom Truah, a day of blasting, striking. It doesn't necessarily mean that you blow the shofar. Not necessarily. So they have decided, the Karaites have decided that the shofar is going to be associated with the temple. So what does it mean to say we're going to have a Yom Truah if we're not blowing horns? Well, we're going to pray loudly, right? That's their interpretation of it. They very rightly point out, it doesn't say anything about a horn at all. So you can do this without blowing a horn, as opposed to Rabbinic Judaism, which will develop chapters upon chapters of law telling you what a shofar should look like, and what you can use for a shofar, and how it's supposed to be made, and who's allowed to blow the shofar, and in what order you select people out of your congregation based on their merit to blow the shofar if you've got a limited number of people that you can accept as shofar blowers. They just don't have it because they don't accept rabbinic law. But they very rightly point out it doesn't say horn. It definitely doesn't say shofar in either of these texts. So even the blowing the shofar is the rabbis deciding that we're going to keep doing this thing that happened at the temple, but now it doesn't happen anymore. And it doesn't necessarily have to happen. So it's all very creative interpretation. So yeah, the Karaites have a point. In some ways, the Karaites are more plain text readers of the Tanakh than the rabbis are. In a lot of senses, they're more plain text readers than the rabbis are. That they just don't build commentary after commentary after commentary and then interpret the commentaries, which is what the rabbis really do, is they go down the rabbit hole of interpreting the commentaries too. So this is the development. You can see what maybe this would look like frozen in time before the rabbis really changed what this holiday was into Rosh Hashanah. Karaites really do say, it's not Rosh Hashanah. That's absurd. Where'd you make that? Where'd you get that from? It's not in the Torah. You can't say that. But for our purposes, right? So humanistic Judaism, like Reform and Conservative and Reconstructionist and Renewal, all these liberal forms of Judaism really are outgrowths of Rabbinic Judaism. So we do the things, right? We have shofar blowing and apples and honey and all of this stuff, right? These things that are connected to Rabbinic Jewish practice, right? We're reinterpreting things and looking at things very differently than is traditional, but we're still really basically an outgrowth of Rabbinic Judaism. We're not Karaites. We're not reinterpreting radically in some ways. So it's useful to look at where you get some of the things that we do and some of the things that we don't do but no other people do on Rosh Hashanah. And last time I talked about the idea of custom versus minhag, right? That there's custom, which is, yeah, this is stuff that we do. It's not the end of the world if you don't do it. And then there's minhag, which gets translated as custom, but really is more binding in the community that creates that custom, that minhag, so that you don't not do it when you live in that community. So this is from the Shulchan Aruch. So this is a legal code from the early 1500s that preserves Sephardic rules, and then has a layer of additional comments that give you what the Ashkenazim do. So the basic Sephardic rule, this is not actually a rule. One should accustom themselves, and the Hebrew here is ragil, so it's not minhag. It's like, yeah, you should do this thing, but it's not the end of the world if you don't. So they say you should eat stuff with multiple seeds or that come in clusters on Rosh Hashanah. So fenugreek, right, because it's things in a pod. Leeks, because it's wrapped up around each other. Beets, you pull beets out of the ground, you just pull one, they come in a cluster sometimes. Dates, date clusters, and pumpkin, because there's seeds in a pumpkin. And when you eat these things with multiple seeds, and it's an Aramaic word, it's rubiah. So when you eat rubiah, you should say, may it be your will that our merits increase. Sheyirbu. Okay, so these are all puns. So you eat this thing that has a resh and a bet in it, and then you say this thing that has a resh and a bet. and leeks are called karti. And so may those who hate us be destroyed. Right? The same consonants are in there. So they're taking these sentiments and tying them to foods that you would eat. And again, this is custom in the sense of, it's good if you do this. But if you decide you're not going to have pumpkin, dates, beets, leeks, and fenugreek on Rosh Hashanah, nobody's kicking you out of the community. So this is real custom. And then the Rema, so the Rema is the Ashkenazi stuff that lies on top of the Shulchan Aruch. The Rema says, and there are those who are accustomed, no hagin, which is related to minhag. There are those who are accustomed, as in this is something you're going to do, to eating sweet apple with honey and saying, may a sweet new year be renewed for us. So you can see this is Sephardic practice, this is Ashkenazic practice. And the Sephardim say, yeah, you can do this, you should, but it's not the end of the world. But Ashkenazim are almost requiring you to eat apples and honey. Where do we get apples and honey from? We get it from the Ashkenazim, who almost made it a law in some of their communities. This is what you're going to do. This is what you do on Rosh Hashanah. One eats the head of a sheep. I'm not aware of... People do still do this, but I have not seen it done. One eats the head of a sheep, saying, may we be like the head and not the tail. May we be smart and not a bunch of asses. That's what this is. And it's a remembrance of Isaac's ram, right? So the story of Abraham about to sacrifice Isaac, and at the last minute, an angel comes and grabs Abraham's hand and says, don't do it. There's a ram over there. Go kill that. That's a Torah portion that's read on Rosh Hashanah, so we mention it here. This is not construed as informal custom. This is the Shulchan Aruch saying, this is what you do. You have to eat the head of a sheep. And the Ashkenazim say, don't eat nuts. Because why not? Don't eat nuts because the gematrological, the Hebrew letters, the value of the Hebrew letters of the word nut, which is egos, equals the value of the Hebrew letters of the word sin. Anybody want to do the math here and see what the problem is?
It doesn't equal.
It doesn't equal.
Yeah, it's not 17 does not equal 18 unless
no. So this legal code actually preserves a mathematical mistake.
Plus 18,
and says that
what happened to 18 high and all that? I thought 18 was good.
Yeah, well, they didn't do the math right. And it got preserved in a legal code for 500 years now. People have been reading this and going, don't eat nuts on... And they know that the math is wrong, by the way. It's not like they haven't done the math. But there's a custom that you don't do that. There's a superstition that you don't do this. And so it's preserved in this legal code. But this is a superstition. This isn't like a binding rule. But the Shulchan Aruch really does say, okay, Ashkenazic Jews, get yourself a sheep's head. Mishnah Berurah is a 19th century Hungarian legal code. So this is one of the ones that you actually rabbis will make rulings off of. Mishnah Berurah interprets Shulchan Aruch. Okay, so on a typical page, the Shulchan Aruch is at the top and Mishnah Berurah is below. So you read up here and then you read down here. Mishnah Berurah says the head of a sheep. Oh, about that. It's best if it's the head of a ram. Because we're remembering Isaac, so it's got to be a ram. Right? This is not an Ashkenazic community saying, hey, you don't have to do it. This is an Ashkenazic community saying, don't get just a sheep's head, get a ram's head. Saying, let us be a head. And therefore, if one doesn't have the head of a sheep, you can eat the head of another livestock animal or of a bird. You know, can't get a sheep. Okay, get a cow. a kosher livestock animal. They're not going to let you bring a pig. Get the head of a cow or get a bird, kosher bird. Or in some communities, this becomes getting a fish head, which more people have seen fish heads on Rosh Hashanah than sheep's heads these days. So some of this stuff is custom, is informal custom, and some of it is, if you live in this community, this is the rule. Like you could expect, in a lot of Sephardic homes, you can expect to see a sheep's head cooked on the table for Rosh Hashanah. So we've got all of these practices, and we have big changes to what happens in the synagogue. So the changes to the regular liturgy used is so big that you don't use a regular prayer book. You use a book called a Machar. Some Machzors cover Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur together. Some of them, there's one for Rosh Hashanah and one for Yom Kippur. And there's big expansion of the Amidah, of the silent prayer. This is where Avinu Malkeinu comes in. This is where Who by Fire comes in, is in these prayers that are ordinarily silent, but here are going to be chanted out loud. Torah service is adjusted. There's more stuff in it. Shofar is blown a bunch of times. In conservative and Orthodox synagogues, you won't hear the shofar on Shabbat. We can talk about why you don't hear the shofar on Shabbat after. And I mentioned that the Untitled Chapter, which is the who by fire, who by water, who by trial or ordeal, and who, right? You probably know the Leonard Cohen song better than you know the actual Untitled Chapter prayer, but that's where he got it from. Is in the Musaf Amidah. This is not a good joke, but I can't help it. So what's a Musaf? Major holidays, pilgrimage festivals, Shabbat, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, had an additional sacrifice. The Hebrew for it is Musaf, which means additional. That the Torah specified for that holiday. Destruction of the temple, the rabbis replaced sacrifices with prayer. So Kathy, when you said, this seems like they're trying to replace A with B. Yes, they absolutely are. They admit that they are. And the Amidah is the main replacement for all these sacrifices. And part of the way they get it to replace the sacrifices is the Amidah mentions wanting the sacrifices to come back. So people recite the Amidah and don't really realize that they're saying, I'd like the temple to be rebuilt. Some people don't really know what they're saying. The Musaf sacrifice, designated for a holiday, became an additional Musaf service with its own Amidah. Reform tends not to have a Musaf service. Conservative tends to, but it's not uniform. And this is, the Amidah is where you get these, is where you get a lot of the additions to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. So the Untitled Chapter, this who by fire, who by water, and the important line in Untitled Chapter, other than that, is on Rosh Hashanah it is written and on Yom Kippur it is sealed. So we tend to teach, in a lot of American Jewish settings, we tend to teach that Rosh Hashanah is the New Year and Yom Kippur is the Day of Atonement, and you got to be done by then. The traditional rabbinic perspective is actually, you really ought to be done before Rosh Hashanah starts, so that you can focus on the prayer part from Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur. You should have tracked down all the people you need to apologize to and gotten that taken care of before Rosh Hashanah. That's what Elul is for. They will tell you that's what that month is for. So the Musaf sacrifice becomes this additional service, and this is where we get the who by fire and who by water, etc., etc., etc. We talk about 10 days of atonement. Aseret Yemei Teshuvah, right? Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur. Slichot is recited during all of these, if you have a synagogue that recites Slichot, the Slichot prayers. But in reality, you're supposed to have been done already. This is all supposed to be finished. You're supposed to be done. You're supposed to have tracked everybody down, and all you're left with is praying that you not get stricken down. But you're supposed to have fixed it already. So the way that particularly most non-Orthodox versions of American Judaism go, where they actually don't talk about what you do in Elul very much. Elul is where the work is supposed to happen, and Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are supposed to be kind of the confirmation of the work being done. So we have a very strange setup. Sort of enabled by the rabbis, but not fully, but really enabled by modern life, right? But this whole period from the first of Elul all the way through to Yom Kippur is supposed to be a real personal reworking, and that's a thing that can kind of carry through even if you're not going to be reciting the Unatana Tokef and worrying about people dying by fire or water or sword or famine or the Four Horsemen or any of that stuff. The Four Horsemen are New Testament. Judaism doesn't have the Four Horsemen. I feel like I should say that. So we're going to stop here because we obviously don't have time to start Yom Kippur, right? So next week we'll do Yom Kippur and probably Sukkot and like Shmini Atzeret, the holiday that nobody knows why it's there. But if you've got questions, feel free to ask questions.
Where did you learn all this stuff?
So some of it in rabbinical school, some before rabbinical school. I read a lot.
You go to the Jewish school before the SHJ rabbinical thing?
College. So so some of my saying modern American Judaism does a bad job of teaching this stuff is I was the product of a conservative synagogue. The only Jewish education I had was what the synagogue provided, which was 6 hours a week. But what I really learned to do there was read Hebrew letters and vowels out loud. I didn't know anything about Judaism until I went to college. So yeah, this is all from age 18 forward.
Cool. I think it's really great learning about this stuff and understanding it in terms of all the doubting that you're doing and explaining how difficult it is to glorify these holidays in the way that we do now, or how they get the meaning that they do now.
Yeah, it's Judaism develops. Even Orthodox Jews will, at the end of the day, admit that Judaism develops and changes over time. We know it. You can watch it happen, right? We just watched it happen with Rosh Hashanah, that it didn't even exist as Rosh Hashanah, and now it's the second most important holiday in the Jewish calendar for many people.
So are you saying that because growing up, I always heard that these 10 days, that's when you went around and asked people for forgiveness. And you're saying, no, that they're expecting, the Orthodox are expecting you to go do that the month before?
Yeah.
Elul.
Yeah. So the month of Elul, that's its job. That's when the period of atonement really starts, when you're supposed to figure out who you need to apologize to and go track them down and figure out what you need to do to make it right. Not those 10 days, right? On Rosh Hashanah it is written. The book is written when you walk into synagogue on Rosh Hashanah. We're just confirming it on Yom Kippur.
Right.
But what you do get those 10 days gives you the chance to repent for what you didn't do. And the way I understand it, if you do repent sincerely, then you get written in.
Right. Like the book can be changed.
Yeah, depending on if you're sincere in your remorse and your apology.
And you should know that it gets very complicated about whether can you even know that you are forgiven. Maimonides has so Maimonides talks about the rules for the shofar stuff on Rosh Hashanah separately from all the atonement stuff. So the atonement stuff is actually at the very beginning of the Mishnah Torah, this legal code, in a section that's actually about loving God. And then all the other stuff is later. The rules for blowing the shofar and all that stuff, it's later, it's with the holidays. So he actually splits Rosh Hashanah into two different places, which is not convenient if you're trying to look for a rule. But he spends a huge amount of time. He has laws of repentance. And he goes into whether you can know that you're forgiven and what the rules are and what kinds of things you can't really sure you're forgiven for until you die. And then maybe you go to heaven and that's how you know you got forgiven. Like if you can't make amends for a thing, right? Because the whole system for fixing what happened with other people presumes that you make amends and those amends are effective. And if they're effective, then, you know, what happens between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur is you square it up with God. That's the traditional theology. But there's a lot of things that you don't have the ability to know that. You've done something to somebody and they die. And unrelated to anything you did, and you can't really make it up to them. And you can't really make it up to their kids. Or you commit murder. Like, he thinks murder is something that you can be forgiven for. But it's a tall order, and you don't know until you die whether you were forgiven. Like, that's how he thinks it works. So it's very complicated. And what it really effectively does, I think this is what the rules really do, is the rules drive people to request apology, and it drives people to grant apology, even when they might not be ready to, because everybody is in a permanent state of existential anxiety about whether you're going to be forgiven, because there's so much stuff you can't know. And that's the real effect of it, is it drives people to go ask for forgiveness when maybe they don't think they did anything wrong, and it drives people to grant forgiveness when maybe they aren't ready to. Because if you don't forgive when you're supposed to forgive, Maimonides says now you're the sinner. So then you've got to atone for not forgiving, right? And it just creates this, like, this is serious. This is serious fear and trembling, right? I'm taking the title from a Kierkegaard book, right? Kierkegaard was not writing about this, but this is serious fear and trembling. Like, this is, if you take it seriously, this is tremendous existential distress, which is why you start in Elul and not on Rosh Hashanah, because it really is a tall order to do this. And you can't be certain that you've succeeded.
A lot of the Yiddish writers talk about that, the experience of the trembling and the fear in Eastern Europe in the last couple of hundred years, but probably before that. We don't know, though, because there was no secular Yiddish writing until a couple of hundred years ago.
Yeah, so, they're called the Seret Yemei Teshuvah, the 10 days of repentance. They are also called Yamim Noraim, the days of awe, right? And this is the awe part, is, am I going to be forgiven? Right? This is how the law is constructed for this. So it's fear and trembling.
This is so extreme. Do other people, or is this just a Jewish thing? Do other people put themselves through this? And any other people that you know of?
Not in precisely this way.
Well, I mean, but there's literally months, or of we're trying to deal with guilt that you're probably not even guilty. You just have to, you've convinced yourself you're guilty of all these things, and then you have to worry about whether you're going to be forgiven.
Yes. So
Is guilt, is this just a Jewish thing, or?
no, so a comparable existential state probably exists if you're a really hardcore Catholic,
Right.
or if you are a really hardcore Calvinist. Because Calvinism has this idea of predestination and also has the idea that you can't know whether you're one of the predestined. But it also,
here you're trying to change fate. In Calvinism, you know you can't change it, right?
right. So Calvinism, some forms of Calvinism say you can't change it. God's decided. But it also says it has this concept of outward signs of inward grace.
Right.
So you can't do anything well, you can't do anything good on your own. But if you're able to do stuff that's right, doesn't that display that maybe you're one of the elect? And then does that drive you to then do things that are right? And then does that then prove that you're forgiven? Right? Like the whole Calvinist system, if you really follow it through, creates a very similar kind of sense of dislocation and guilt in a different way, but it creates the same sense of I don't really know. So that's the most comparable one that I can think of.
I just can't help but think of the old Stephen Colbert and his original show, where every Yom Kippur he would have a big phone on his desk, and he would put up a phone number. And he said, "Any of my Jewish friends out there who want to call me and ask me for forgiveness of anything they've done to me, call me now." And people would call. I mean, it was all prearranged, but some Jewish comedian or politician would call in, and it would be very funny. It was the funniest thing I've ever seen.
But
that to me is the way to do it.
Yeah, but it's a real, like, this kind of existential distress is like real in very traditional circles, and is real in Calvinism and in some forms of Catholicism in a way that is shocking, right? And is something that chases a lot of people out of those churches or out of Orthodox Judaism. So, yeah. Other questions? I feel like there was something I was going to explain and lost it.
Yeah.
No, I don't remember. So, okay, I'm gonna. Where's the stop?
That was wonderful. Thank you very much, Jeremy.
Yeah.